the Witcher series. If you play video games, you probably know it. If you've been following this channel for any length of time, you know I know more about The Witcher than real-world history. Initially a book series, The Witcher games had a fairly rocky start, with the first actual released game in 2007 doing pretty alright for itself, The Witcher 2 in 2011 doing much better, and The Witcher 3 in 2015 blowing the lid off things quite entirely. We all know the mainline series, but there were others. I have a different video about their failed mobile ventures, but CD Projekt also tapped into the freak popularity of The Witcher 3's side game, Gwent. They launched Gwent, the Witcher card game, as an online multiplayer version that looked and played much the same as the main game's variant. 3 rows, leader cards, spy cards for some extremely ill-advised reason, but that eventually evolved into a playing screen meant to look more like a battlefield than a board. That version, finally, was used in a story-driven RPG called Thronebreaker: The Witcher Tales. Thronebreaker has a bit of card game, a bit of choices matter, and a lot of visual novel about it. I'll go over the story eventually, but I'm not going to start with it like I usually do. I'd like to try and convince you to give the game a try yourself first, because I really like Thronebreaker, but it didn't do well enough to get another entry. The Witcher Tales already implies that they initially wanted to do more of them, and several hints within the game even tell us what that next installment might have been, and I'm vaguely annoyed that low sales deprived me of the next chapter. Thronebreaker reviewed well across the board, which makes its flop even more puzzling. Apparently it was mainly caused by the GOG exclusivity deal. It was released on Steam not long after when CDPR realized their mistake, but too little too late. Even now, with over 14,000 reviews on Steam and a very positive rating, there's no news of new Witcher Tales. The game had not met their initial, apparently fairly lofty sales expectations. The Witcher 1 with over 57,000 reviews, Witcher 2 with over 75,000, and Witcher 3 with over 750,000 do tend to skew your perspective a bit, I feel. And they also admit that in their earnings call at the time. Regarding further installments of The Witcher Tales, we have made no announcements in this regard. Of course, depending on the results of Thronebreaker, well, I assume that it will continue to positively affect our bottom line. It is not, of course, a financial failure. It's just that our expectations are very high. So our takeaway should be, Thronebreaker is good. It's a good game and people enjoy it, so why didn't it do well enough? GOG's exclusivity deal shouldn't outweigh the fact that this was a solid Witcher game. The Witcher was outrageously popular in its own right. Was it the gameplay? Was it the advertisement? I have my own thoughts, but I decided this time I would also ask my community for their thoughts. Had they played it? Did they enjoy it? And importantly, how did they hear about it, if they did at all? So I set up a survey and sent it around Twitch, Discord, Blue Sky, and, of course, this YouTube channel. For a very long time, I was a Witcher lore channel, so a lot of my audience loves The Witcher, which should mean that overwhelmingly they would have played this Witcher game, or at the very least, they would have heard of it. Except about 23% had not played Thronebreaker at all. Out of that 23%, almost 8% weren't even interested in the game to begin with. And most surprisingly, for almost 8% of the people answering my little questionnaire, this survey was the first time they'd ever heard of Thronebreaker at all. Not too surprising then that a near 80% felt like CDPR did not do enough to promote Thronebreaker. Because on the topic of hearing about the game, only 25% heard about it through CDPR directly. Almost 33% only ever found the game because they actively look for new Witcher games to play. Let's give this survey a little rundown beyond the numbers. The first question I asked those who'd played the game was, did you complete it? It was a very even split of yes and no, but the no answers generally had more detailed answers as to the why of it. I wasn't a big fan of Gwent. Unfortunately, none of Thronebreaker's main characters resonated with me, and the overall plot also didn't stand out to me, so there wasn't really anything in the game to keep my interest. I felt the game was a little too much, there is only one way to win an encounter. No, once I realized there was only autosaving on a single save, I felt a little cheated. A lot of the decisions gave me information after I made a choice that would have changed my decision if I knew it earlier. It means I just got to the point where making choices in the game felt like a chore rather than something to interact with willingly. I'm still in the middle of a playthrough, but it hasn't caught my eye as an experience I'm wanting in the moment when I sit down and play. A few people also admitted to just getting distracted easily, but the main reasons often seems to be there wasn't enough there to get invested in, and Gwent exists. Thronebreaker is a game that relies heavily on its choices and consequences to keep the player invested, but you can't get invested if you're not into the characters. And at that point, if you don't enjoy Gwent either, there's not much left. Not liking Gwent, or the difficulty problem in general, does have a very direct fix if you really just want to experience the story. If you start Thronebreaker on Adventurer mode, you're allowed to skip the card battles completely. After starting a battle and losing it or forfeiting on purpose, you can press skip and move on with your day. At the same time, this dislike for Gwent might have been one of the reasons the game didn't do as well as it could have. Gwent itself has gone through a lot of iterations. I started playing in the very early days. This is what that looked like. The people who I played Gwent with all loved the game. It resembled the Witcher 3 board fairly closely, but it was a lot more colorful. The way Gwent worked also set it apart from a lot of its other direct competitors like Hearthstone and Magic the Gathering. But the game wasn't particularly well balanced, probably because it emulated the Witcher 3 version so much. The early releases included spy cards, and if you've played any of the Witcher 3's Gwent, you'll know why that's a bad idea. Changes were made over time, first to the power of certain cards, then to the gameplay, and eventually the game got an overhaul so massive it was practically a relaunch. It was called Homecoming. The Homecoming update tried to address a number of issues, but it also tried its best to make balancing cards a little easier. Gwent initially had 3 rows, but they were shrunk down to 2. The rows also had no limit before. You could throw as many cards on a row as you liked, as evidenced by the monster decks of old. Look at my extremely viable strategy from back then. But now you could only place 9 cards in each row, severely limiting your ability to just flood the field with smaller cards. Deck building changed from using a structure based around general card types, in this case gold, silver, and bronze, to using provisions where each card would be worth a certain number of points, and you could only have so many points in your deck. You could only add 2 copies of a bronze card instead of 3 as well, which generally meant you'd need a few filler cards. Cards you didn't really want to end up playing, but were needed to fill out the deck. And the board's look changed entirely. You were now a battlefield commander. You didn't have a leader card, you had a model of your leader on the side of the field, yelling orders whenever you played a card. In the initial announcement post for Homecoming, they mentioned that in Gwent, you're meant to be the leader of an army in the Witcher world, and they wanted the visuals to reflect that. They also felt like the card art didn't get a chance to shine with the current 3-row design, which is why they eventually decided to shrink the board down to 2 rows. The problem was, Homecoming didn't really sit well with the Gwent community at the time, and that's putting it mildly. A lot of favored deck archetypes were in the gutter after the update. I don't think anyone really felt like they were a battlefield commander in Gwent either. We thought we were at a table with Geralt playing a card game. The board no longer popped, it was just another brownish field in most cases. The game not having any sort of interactions either didn't help. Turns had gotten longer with the addition of orders, generally targeted abilities on cards that required a lot of forethought in higher level play. Sometimes those orders would take a while to complete. It felt like an unnecessary aesthetic change on top of a general slowdown of the gameplay itself. I do want to be clear, Gwent needed this overhaul. I loved early Gwent, I had an absolute blast with it, but if I'm completely honest with myself, I knew even back then that this version of the game had no longevity. For the sake of balance and healthier deck builds, it had to be done. But Homecoming was a damn rough start that didn't have nearly enough testing under its belt before it released in the state it did. Even if it improved down the line, the damage was already done. Overall, the beta player base felt like things were taken away from them more than things were added to improve their general experience. And even if that wasn't the case, feelings do matter in these situations. One of the criticisms levied against CDPR at the time was that they didn't do a very good job listening to their player base, and that has merit. Some of those very broken cards made it into the beta initially, despite a team of seasoned card game players telling them that the cards would have to be changed or removed entirely because of their current, very broken state. Why is this relevant for Thronebreaker? It's relevant because Thronebreaker was announced in the same breath as Homecoming. Thronebreaker was the capstone for the entire rework. It was originally meant to be a single-player addition to the online Gwent game until it was built out to be a standalone game. The game itself used the new Army Commander board style and the Provisions gameplay. Homecoming receiving as much pushback as it did wasn't a great start for Thronebreaker. Even if people came back after a while when they wanted to give Gwent another try, Thronebreaker had already lost that early momentum from the exact group of people who would otherwise be first in line to try it. If you were one of the people who just didn't like the changes made to Homecoming, give Thronebreaker a go anyway. While provisions and the row limits still apply, they are far more lenient in a story game setting. There are ways to increase the number of provisions you're allowed, and plenty of cards that sacrifice your own units to make room for more. Especially if you play on the lower difficulties, you'll have a great deal of freedom in how you build your deck. The battles that only allow for one answer are generally either very specific story battles or puzzle battles. Once you get further into the game, you'll find plenty of very regular Gwent matches. And if you'd really rather not engage with the Gwent side of things, the skip button's there to save you the headache. I've always been a fan of being able to save your game as often as you like, and when games lock you into a singular save with autosaves, that does rub me the wrong way. Even if the creators would prefer you play a certain way because that's the way they envisioned it, it's just a bad decision in a choices matter game. It reduces a player's agency in how they want to engage with your game. In some cases, for art's sake, I can see the merit, but to be perfectly honest, I think CDPR just wants their games to sell well. When it comes to Thronebreaker, it is absolutely true that you don't get all the information regarding your decisions immediately. But that's not new to Thronebreaker. That's true for every Witcher game. The difference being, you can save before making decisions and reload if you truly don't like the result. Thronebreaker isn't nearly as long as a mainline Witcher game though, so I imagine they meant for you to replay the game at least once, now that you knew the consequences of some of your actions. Which is a fair approach, but certainly not one everyone aligns with. If replaying the game is something you really don't enjoy, I'm afraid there's not much I can say to change your mind. And some decisions, I will admit, are not well thought out. We'll get to that when we discuss the story more directly. First, let's talk about the characters. Not connecting to the characters in a game like this is a pretty massive problem, because at the end of the day, your choices matter game can only have their choices matter if your player cares about what happens to their main characters. It was one of The Witcher 3's main attractions. Quests like the Bloody Baron, Keira Metz, or Skellige. A lot of the choices you make in The Witcher 3 are based around characters you've already bonded with, got invested in, either because you really didn't like them and wanted them to get theirs, or because you were attached to them and wanted to see them survive. In Thronebreaker, you start with Queen Meve alongside her trusted advisor, Reynard. Throughout the game, you can recruit more main characters that also join your army as cards in your deck. Each of these characters have their own personality and can and will leave your army if you piss them off in some fashion. But because of that, you don't really get much time to become invested in them as a person. Once recruited, you can find each character inside of the mess tent to have a little chat with them, but generally speaking, they don't have a great deal to say, especially the companions that are easy to miss. Just a few lines about their past and perhaps their future, with some exceptions. In the end, the only characters you get any particularly deep story on are Meve, Reynard, Gascon, and to a point, a dwarf named Gabor. Everyone else is fairly shallow. A few are very easily lost, some are one-dimensional or have a single big reveal, and then never bother to speak again. It's easy to see why people might not really connect with a cast like that. And in terms of choices, the majority of them aren't made with a further story in mind. They're made to have consequences for Meve and her army, And those consequences almost exclusively have to do with resources. That isn't engaging in a storytelling sense. You'll find scenes that are shocking, and Maeve and her retinue are going to have their reactions one way or the other, but they're also moving forward. The army is going somewhere, and Maeve is a queen. There aren't any long-term effects. Things that haunt you throughout the rest of the game when it comes to side questing specifically. The most you'll ever get is a betrayal from someone you picked up 10 minutes back, because it turned out they were actually a spy. It pales compared to the Bloody Baron questline in Witcher 3. That is understandable in some ways, of course. This is a side project that didn't have as many resources as a mainline game did, and a lot of the focus does go towards fitting Gwent in where they can too. But the Witcher games have built themselves on dramatic, personal stories. That goes for the books as well as the games. That type of storytelling doesn't have room to shine in a story where the main character hasn't the time to stick around to see what happens next. And I really can't blame someone picking up a Witcher game for expecting that sort of experience, especially in a game that's very specifically a visual novel with card gameplay aspects. Having said that, Maeve's story alone was enough for me to be invested, and I personally really liked Gascon as a character. He's the affable rogue with a tragic backstory archetype, and he pulls it off very well. Thronebreaker takes place during the Second Northern Nilfgaardian War, and Maeve's story does a great job of making you feel like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. That both everything is lost, but you also can't simply give up as long as there's still a chance. Mind you, Thronebreaker does break canon story-wise here and there, not just because in the books Maeve's hair is grey, almost as pale as Geralt's, and not blonde, and Odo's cloak is purple, not yellow. Sorry, 2 seconds of pedantry. But largely because her story is structured around the time she appears in the books with Geralt. Maeve doesn't have many appearances in the Witcher books otherwise, so we don't learn all that much. But we do know that she has 2 sons. For some reason, only one of them makes an appearance, despite the ongoing war. They also threw a very strange retcon Rayla's way. She's now a half-elf on her mother's side, and the reason she hates elves is because she was bullied for being half-elven. But they only bullied her because they were scared of the Scoia'tael. So by her logic, she should stop the Scoia'tael because they divide the races. In the books, it's made quite clear that the reason Rayla hates the Scoia'tael is because she's seen too many of her comrades fall to them in horrific ways. She also doesn't have pointed ears in any fashion, so this was an odd and unnecessary choice. Now, like I said, I really enjoyed Maeve's story as well as Gascon's side commentary. That doesn't mean I think the story was the best one to start with, strangely. This comes back to my earlier point regarding personal stories. I asked people what they expected from this game going in, and unsurprisingly, a solid 90% expected a good story. But about 61% also hoped for lore on characters they knew little about. Maeve fits that mold for book readers, but when you think about it, where would the majority of people have started on their Witcher journey? Probably The Witcher 3, at least video game-wise. Otherwise, the Netflix show. While Maeve has a great story, I don't think she was the right choice for your first Witcher Tales installment. She was too obscure for non-book readers. Perhaps they were keen on ensuring that the main character was an army commander, so the Gwent board would make more sense, but in that case, it's already an unnecessary constriction. If you can only build a Witcher Tales game around army leaders, you'll run out of main characters fairly quickly. And this isn't necessarily a spoiler for the game itself, but would have been for future games. Throughout Thronebreaker, you can find a few lines hinting at the next Tales game involving Iorveth from The Witcher 2, another army commander. Am I enraged that this installment never materialized? Yes, but I thank you for asking. Without the army leader tag, you could have picked Dandelion instead. One of the most enigmatic, charismatic, and beloved characters on the main cast that we don't truly learn about save through Geralt's eyes in most cases. At least in the games. Dandelion's adventures as a spy, visiting the various courts, escaping yet another self-inflicted life-threatening situation would be extremely entertaining to follow. And Dandelion is a very easy sell to the public, even more so after the Netflix show. Then, once Witcher Tales had established itself as a concept, you could bring in the more obscure characters, like Maeve. Because, and I know I sound like a broken record here, Thronebreaker is good. It's a good game. Over 90% of the people surveyed said the game lived up to their expectations, with the vast majority of people rating the game a 7 or higher. The choices were generally considered to make a decent impact and did inspire some replays. The stumbling block here was more so the Gwent gameplay. People who had never played Gwent before overwhelmingly just did not enjoy the gameplay. The gameplay does entail more than just Gwent, but I mainly want to discuss this under a separate header from the Gwent section, because it's less about how a card game enthusiast might feel versus how a general gamer would experience the game. In combination with the rest of the gameplay, however, I can see how it might become frustrating very quickly. Thronebreaker lets you create cards through the use of resources found on the map. Traversing the map is as easy as clicking anywhere on the ground. Meve will walk over, and if there are resources on the floor like wood or gold, you can pick them up. You take those resources into the army camp you travel with to upgrade your army, represented by your deck. The higher the difficulty you chose, the lower the amount of resources you'll find throughout the game. By the end, you'll have a fair few cards available to use. Even if you don't make any new cards yourself, you'll find allies and items throughout the story automatically. If you've played Gwent before, this won't be an issue. You're used to deck building and you're used to how Gwent feels, but if you haven't, this can easily become overwhelming. Firstly, because there's a lot of new terminology to learn. Ambush cards are played face down, but they aren't specifically explained, so when you see a card played in this way, it'll be confusing. Banish being different from a discard, effects getting triggered from top left to bottom right, is just something you'll have to find out for yourself. Haunt doesn't show you direct numbers, summon not counting as deploy. Worse, if you've never played a card game of this type in general. You'd first have to learn the value of card advantage and what does and doesn't constitute good synergy. If you play on the easiest mode though, you can skip battles. But the games themselves also become astoundingly more forgiving. Your starting deck has the Lyrian Scytheman, for example. On Adventurer mode, they will have 9 base strength. On Bonebreaker, they have 5. But just being easier doesn't mean it won't feel overwhelming. At that point, a new player might still make progress, but they won't necessarily enjoy it or feel accomplished. Then there's the problem some of the camp upgrades run into. There's an upgrade that costs 1,000 gold and 100 wood. It decreases the gold cost of creating units by 10%. There's an almost 100% chance that you won't make that gold back, because you really won't make that many units over the course of the game. Even if you make the most expensive gold unit you can find, you'd need to craft over 47 of them to break even. And while the wood is easier to break even on with only 5 units, you'd still have wasted the gold you could have used to simply buy more wood. And you'd also, for some inexplicable reason, have chosen to craft 5 pitfall traps, and that's just not particularly helpful in any combat situation. The real reason you'd ever upgrade that part of the tree is to get to the unit cap upgrades instead. And that makes using the upgrade at all feel bad. That's the last thing you want your players to feel when buying upgrades. The Herald study is even worse. It lets you gain soldiers, a currency used to craft units, after every battle won. But even on Bonebreaker difficulty, I was swimming in soldiers on account of still not really crafting very many at all. By the end of the game, I was sitting on 339 soldiers, while always picking the dialogue options that would cost me soldiers when given the chance, because I knew I wouldn't be using them. Even if I somehow had the final Herald study upgrade from the very beginning of the game, and I'd done every single possible encounter I could by that point, that would only account for 286 of those soldiers. Then there's the tutorial, an unskippable, fairly slow slog. Especially if you're ever going for a replay, it slows the game down immensely. Someone mentioned specifically quitting at the betrayal part because of the lack of battles that use your own deck in lieu of an event deck, so to speak. That's a relatively early event. If people fall off your game early, that means they won't ever get to the meat of it. And there's no denying that Thronebreaker starts off fairly uneventful and slow. Once again, comparing it to the mainline Witcher games, it doesn't really hold up. The Witcher 1 opens with Geralt's amnesia and an attack on the castle. Witcher 2 opens with Geralt in prison and retelling another attack on a castle. The Witcher 3 opens with a naked lady and oh, you're in a castle again and it's under attack, even if it's only a dream. Thronebreaker also opens with a cutscene, but because it's more a storybook style than anything else, it doesn't have that same energy. You then start with standing and talking a while before veering into the slow Gwent tutorial. A lot of these things are strictly game-type created problems. And I say problems, but I don't even think that's what they really are. They're more differences than anything. Thronebreaker's gameplay is so completely different from the usual Witcher games that I'm not surprised a lot of regular Witcher fans bounced off the game entirely. You're not part of the action directly at any point. You either move Meve on the map, click dialogue options, or play card games. If none of that appeals to you, nothing I say will convince you that the gameplay is worth the price of admission. So, another survey question for the people who hadn't played Thronebreaker was, were you interested in the game at all? Around 93% said yes, so why didn't they buy it? Other games were out at the time that I wanted to play, and since then, I haven't really thought much about it. I barely heard of it, not sure even which platform it's on. I only realized years later that this game existed. The gameplay looked too much like that of a mobile game, and while I enjoy Gwent as a minigame within The Witcher occasionally, but not enough to play a game based around it. I wouldn't mind a game without Geralt, it just has to be done right, and I don't think what they sold in that regard looked particularly interesting. I didn't know what the game was about exactly. It just kind of slipped off my mind like water off a duck's back. I knew it was there, it was Witcher, and then it was gone. I had never heard of this game. Overwhelmingly, people just forgot about it. They'd vaguely heard of its existence, only to let the memory pass into the realms of, yeah, I guess I'll check it out one day, like my Steam wishlist. Other times, the game just wasn't sold to them at all. It looked a certain way, and that way didn't appeal or didn't convey the game's core well. A lack of time or price was very rarely mentioned in the equation. When I asked what would have to change for them to give the game a chance, the answers were largely nothing. The moment had passed. Some people had moved on from The Witcher entirely, some would appreciate the setting but in a completely different game format, but a sale would be nice. Over 78% of the people I asked felt CDPR did not do enough to promote Thronebreaker, and I have to agree with that. To this day, I'll mention Thronebreaker on my stream every once in a while and get a handful of quizzical responses in return. If even general Witcher fans don't know the game exists, it'll have an even harder time introducing potential new fans to the franchise. Even though you don't need to know anything about The Witcher to enjoy this game, most people have heard of The Witcher before and might assume they need some form of backstory before diving in. So, Thronebreaker sold well, but not well enough. CDPR didn't seem interested in pushing it over much, so why should you play it? Before I get into the story, I'll give you a short list. First of all, the soundtrack is genuinely so good. Normally when I'm editing a video for this channel and it's about a specific game, I try to use music from that game unless I can't really find anything that makes sense. I'll comb through the OST and pick out tracks here and there, ending up with a handful of choices, maybe 5 or 6 tops. For Thronebreaker, I just downloaded the entire OST because it's all wonderful. You should listen to it even if you don't plan on playing the game. The art style is something of a mix between cel shading and realism, giving it a very playable comic book aura that really appeals to me. And given that it's essentially a visual novel in terms of actual story, it fits very well. Outside of general Gwent card battles, the game also comes with puzzle battles. Those were usually my favorites because you had to think a little more directly about the timing, placement, and play order of your cards. They also make for excellent ways to break up the gameplay with something just a little bit out of the ordinary. Most importantly though, especially where The Witcher's concerned, I like the story and I really like Meve. As I'm writing this script, we've been playing through Yakuza 5 on my Twitch stream for some time now. Yakuza 5 sparked another small discussion about the writing of female characters in media. Not just video games, but in general. Most often when a woman is portrayed as strong, independent, and capable, they also have to sprinkle in a little bit of harpy personality in there. I can't say the other word because YouTube will yell at me. Meve breaks that mold in Thronebreaker. You don't have to be a tyrannical monster playing as Meve. You can certainly make decisions that would seem callous otherwise, but this is also a country at war, so generally the actions you choose, if they hurt the locals, are meant to bolster your chances at thwarting the invaders. You know, the ones that burned everyone's homes to the ground and butchered entire family trees. They're not made for the sake of cruelty, as a crutch to show us how tough and capable of making the hard decisions the female lead is. Even then, you don't have to make those decisions. You can play Meve as a kind and just ruler who respects treaties and stays true to her word, her heart, and her people, even at great cost to herself. Through it all, she remains strong, wise, and capable. The story itself, as someone who's painfully invested in the Witcher world, was one I'd been interested in for some time. We get very little of Meve in the books and even less in the games. The one meeting you do get with her in the books makes an impression, though. Does it follow the canon? Not quite, no. But the holes are insignificant, and it didn't irk me in the least while playing through the game. And in all honesty, I'm glad they made some changes. Strictly speaking, we already know how the story must end. History has already been written. What matters is making the journey there interesting, and they did a wonderful job in that respect. If you're one of the people who just didn't vibe with Gwent or the gameplay surrounding resources in general, ignore all of it. You can. Play on the lowest setting, skip every single battle, and just don't collect resources at all. You won't need to, because the main story will give you more than enough resources to deal with story-related events, and anything else would only be used to buy camp upgrades anyway. Just play through the story and see how you feel. The game goes on sale often enough, all the way down to 80% at times. Give it a chance. Now, I will take you through the story for a minute too, so I can talk about a few things that I really can't address without it, but I will give you another out before the second big twist, if you can even call the first one a twist at all. And I'll stay vague about most of the smaller events I decide to mention. A band of mercenaries are sat around a table, accompanied by a single prisoner in shackles. Apparently the man had riled up the Queen of Zerrikania. The mercenaries ask him to tell them another tale, and so the man tells of Queen Meve. The year is 1267, and Meve has returned to her kingdom after a summit with the northern kings regarding Nilfgaard's looming presence at their borders. Mid-journey, they are approached by Count Coldwell, who informs them of the strays of Spalla, a group of bandits now roaming the countryside. Meve, piqued that Caldwell couldn't handle a few bandits, resolves to deal with them herself. This is the tutorial section. You learn how the game works while Meve is met with the first signs of destruction in her kingdom. Bandit ambushes, riled merchants, and ghouls in broad daylight. You also get access to the map, and I love the map especially because it looks downright medieval, which is the point, but still worth mentioning. You're also introduced to the morale mechanic. Morale in this game comes in 3 forms: good, neutral, and bad. If your morale is good, all of your cards receive a +1 bonus to their usual point value. At neutral, nothing changes. With bad morale, a -1 is applied instead. And the entire card game revolves around getting more points than your opponent. Morale changes depending on events and battles. If you finish a Gwent battle, your morale will always return to neutral. Praying at shrines around the map gives you a boost to morale, but if you punch a peasant in the face to steal his treasure map, morale goes down. I mentioned this mechanic during the story segment because morale is actually mostly pointless, and for me, it has story implications more than anything. Even on Bonebreaker difficulty, I didn't care about bad morale, especially when given the choice between gaining 100 wood for free on account of throwing a peasant in the proverbial river or paying someone 500 gold for it instead. Morale, no matter which way, only lasts a single battle, and you can build some monstrous decks in this game, completely circumventing morale boosts. Adding to that, your deck requires a minimum of 25 cards to be playable, but not all of those cards have to be, or should be, unit cards. You'll have several trinkets equipped to Meve, and those aren't worth any points on their own. Like this banner that allows you to use your leader's ability more often, or this beer that buffs a unit on each row by 2 every single round. Given that information, even if you fill a deck to the brim with unit cards, the morale only swings for 25 points. That sounds like a lot, but it really isn't. The most basic card available to you, the Lyrian Scytheman, boosts itself by 5 each time you use your leader's ability. 7 once you upgrade him. He's passed the 25-point mark after 3 leadership charges. On Bonebreaker difficulty, resources are extremely scarce. Even knowing when and how resource-draining events would take place, so I could prepare for them by emptying my pockets, I still didn't manage to build out my entire camp by the end. Not even close. So if you want to make the most of your army, you're going to have to punch some peasants. A single battle's 25-point swing is not worth losing the 100 wood over. I thought about this for a while during my last playthrough because part of me knows that it's just a matter of balancing, but accidentally that added a story element for me. On the lower settings, I didn't really have to make decisions. If a group of peasants told me they needed 1,000 gold to feed their hungry caterpillar, I could hand over my treasury without issue. I'd make it back in seconds anyway, and knew I didn't really need to upgrade my army to win either way. So as far as impactful decisions go, I had none. I picked up an elf who turned out to be an evil prisoner. No worries, I lost a few units and who cares about those? Avalanche took all of my gold and wood and even more units, whatever, I'll get them back down the road. On Bonebreaker though, I had to think about it. Realistically, I could still help everyone, same as I did on Adventurer mode, cruise through with high morale. The only fight I really had to think about in the end was the final battle after all. For that reason, it gave me more pause. It was a psychological thing for me. I don't like hurting video game characters. It makes me feel bad when the pixels get mad or sad. I could still help everyone, but on Bonebreaker, not punching the peasants in the face and instead giving them my life savings presented a real, tangible downgrade to my army. No, I could not just go and make it back. And because morale doesn't mean jack, punching versus paying, despite the sad pixels, became more enticing. Because at the end of the day, that was the only real consequence. Sad pixels. I'm not going to pretend to know what the intention was here for the developers, but to me, that makes Bonebreaker just a little more interesting. If you really don't want to make the pixels sad, if this is your first playthrough, you won't know what's going to happen to your resources at any given time. That means you might run into a story event to help the poor, unhoused orphans of Lyria moments after you upgraded your royal cantina with more beer. Now you don't have enough golden wood to rebuild the orphanage regardless of your decision. You've already traded orphans for beer. I made a lot more punching peasants in the face decisions on Bonebreaker than I ever would otherwise. But wood is really quite rare and I cannot fix your cart, young man, if all you're offering me is morale. My army can't build a beer tent with morale. It would have been more interesting if, after too many low morale moments, part of your army would simply desert you, or they'd break one of your camp upgrades to show their discontent. As it is, they suck it up no matter what you do. At that point, though, the game technically poses the moral quandary: if I offered you no reward, would you still be kind? Which, even if unintentional, feels a little worthwhile at least. Anyway, down the line you meet Gascon, leader of the Strays of Spalla bandits. He's busy plundering a village, smarms at Meve, who doesn't smarm back because she's a queen, and they do not smarm, they scowl. Once defeated, he's sent off to the capital's dungeons, while news of Nilfgaard crossing the borders at last reaches the royal retinue. Nilfgaardian ambassadors and spies now appear every which way, as Meve's army rushes to aid Dravograd, besieged by the Blackclads. They arrive too late, and even though Nilfgaard is beaten back, Dravograd is in ruins. Meve grits her teeth and marches on to run into Ike of Denel. This is one of several units you can recruit. When you ask him to join your army, he initially refuses on account of a nearby manticore. If you offer to help him slay the beast, though, he can be persuaded to travel with you. Ike is one of the most useful companions in the entire game, because every so often you'll come across a monster nest of some kind, and instead of sending your own men to their deaths, you can send Ike. Not to his death, he just gives you free loot, and no peasants need receive a fist to the face in exchange. We reach the capital soon after, and Meve is welcomed home by her eldest son, Willem, whom she left in charge of the throne in her absence. Willem is behaving somewhat suspiciously, though, and we soon find out why. During a meeting with Willem, Count Coldwell, and several nobles, they reveal an accord they've struck with Nilfgaard behind Meve's back, to bend the knee. Meve unsurprisingly rejects such a deal and is thrown in prison for her efforts, betrayed by her son and Coldwell, who had been planning for this for some time now. Coldwell plans to betray Willem later down the line, but for now, he visits Meve in her cell to smarm. Very unroyal-like behavior, as we know. The game allows you to tell Coldwell to go plow himself, which, while no doubt also unroyal-like, I truly appreciate. Before Caldwell can enact his murder plot, Gascon breaks out of his own jail and into Meave's to free her, purely to spite the Count. Together they free Reynard, Meave's loyal advisor, and a number of strays before making their way out of the city. Meave plans to ride for Eddern to call on Demovin's aid. Amused, Gascon decides to join her for the long run. I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure how Ike factors into this entire prison and breakout plot, but I won't ask. En route to Eddern, the company runs into Black Rayla, about to be hung by a group of Scoia'tael, elven rebels. Saving her recruits her as another companion, but unlike Ike, Rayla mostly brings wanton violence directed at anything remotely Scoia'tael related to the table. We find Eddern in flames, including Rosberg, the otherwise unbreachable keep. In the rubble, a single survivor, Xavier Lemons, a now horribly burned engineer. He vows vengeance on Nilfgaard and requests we let him join the retinue to enact it. Another companion, this time one who can fix things like bridges on the world map. The road would now lead through the Moulder Wood. Eldane, leader of the Scoia'tael unit that captured Rayla and attacked Rosberg, lurked neath its branches. Before we deal with Eldane, though, we find the game's most important optional companion. I'll just pause here in case you've changed your mind about spoilers and really want to play the game, actually. Give it a minute. All right.
Instead of monsters, out of the hut came a shaggy dog, a torn scrap of fabric clutched in its teeth.
Milady,
One of the soldiers began, his face red with embarrassment and his hands covering a hole in his breeches.
was dark as a well inside, and that hound, it jumped out at us all of a sudden, biting it and snapping.
Bad boy,
Gascon said with a smile.
We find Knickers, the dog. He hangs out at the bar, shows up on the battlefield whenever you play a gold card, and eats any snacks you might hold in your hand at any given time. You can choose not to pick up Knickers, the dog, but you shouldn't. You'll go to hell. In real life. I'm sure you'd like to avoid that. Knickers in tow, we finally enter the Moulder Wood proper, and are immediately met with a giant tree covered in almost dead people, covered in turn in sweet tree sap. When we try to touch the sap people, elves jump out. What a welcome. Eldane eventually reveals himself near an elven graveyard. In defeat, he begs we bury his body with dignity, despite all the horrifying murders he's committed. Some of them directly in front of our face. I know Iorveth did a lot of horrifying murder also, but it's different. Unless you refuse to bury him, Rayla will also leave your party later down the line. When leaving the forest, we can find another companion in a little side area, Isbel. She's currently healing bandits because they threatened her. Meave mentioned that she could simply kill the bandits to free herself, but Isbel is anti-killing. We recruit her on the premise that she will never have to kill, only heal. I find her position somewhat hilarious because when Isbel is initially reluctant, Meave mentions the civilians in her army, and Isbel retorts that the civilians do their part in the slaughter, and indirect guilt is enough. Isbel, my love, what did you think the bandits you're healing were doing? Braiding flower crowns? By her own logic, she's a mass murderer. She's useful as a sorceress on the world map, but also very easy to lose on account of her stringent principles. Sorceress in hand, the army reaches Aldersburg too late. As before, it's in flames. Besieged by Nilfgaard, Demovind is still here on account of his mistress, a prostitute currently giving birth to a son. Meave holds off the Nilfgaardians until the baby is born, and both armies flee the city by way of a secret tunnel. Demovind no longer has a standing army to support us, but he does give Meave a ring that will grant her an audience with Brover Hoog of Mahakam, as well as use of Black Rayla's tracking skills to escort her to the Dwarven lands, where we meet Gabor Zigrin. He joins our party and acts as our guide through the mountains. In Mahakam, our mission becomes convincing Brover Hoog, the Dwarven chief, that we're deserving of his support in this war. That takes the form of aiding the other Dwarven clans, so they might speak on our behalf. But we're also to follow the rules of neutrality while in their lands, so no murdering Nilfgaardians. I generally ignore that advice, because even if you do everything right, the units you'll receive by the end do not outweigh the pleasure of stabbing Nilfgaardians directly in the face and twisting the knife. There's another companion to recruit as well, one of the most useful ones. Barnabas Beckenbauer, BB to friends. He's a gnome engineer who comes up with interesting solutions to world map problems, and he also crafted a high-quality dildo.
Do tell. What was the thing you created exactly?
I knew you'd be interested. You've a curious mind, dear Queen. We're 2 peas of a feather. Quite the clever contraption it was. Made for a widow, wealthy but aching with longing. In her husband's absence, tormented by unfulfilled needs.
Stop right there. I knew I'd regret asking.
And see, it had this special crank that when rotated...
Barnabas, no, enough.
Something of a revelation is also revealed in Ye Mountains, so for the last time, I'll give it a minute in case you want to change your mind on playing the game. Do it for knickers. Alright, during our Mahakam venture, we are informed that there's a traitor in our camp. We have no clue who, how much they know, or what their eventual goal is, but Meave's on high alert. There's also a very, very silly moment in the mountains that can cause you to lose Ike. 2 of the clans ask Meave to go measure some mountain peaks and see which one's higher. One of those clans is the Hoog clan, Bruver's clan. Meave considers that she could lie and say the Hoog clan's peak is bigger than the others to curry favor with Bruver. If you do that though, Ike will leave because he doesn't like lying, even though you can lie in a lot of other places and he doesn't bat an eye. I imagine he must be quite sensitive about the size of things for some reason. Either way, we make it back to Bruver, and he already knows everything that's happened, but before he can give us his final verdict, we cross a bridge with him and are promptly attacked by Scoia'tael, trying to assassinate Meave in retaliation for Eldain. This little stunt convinces Bruver to give Meave at least some units, regardless of her performance otherwise, so Nilfgaard can see what riling up dwarves to join the Scoia'tael accomplishes. Somehow Willem has also made his way up to the mountains at this exact moment to speak to Meave. He attempts to persuade her to return and accept Nilfgaardian rule, but Meave mentions that slavery is bad actually, and Willem leaves without changing her mind. But Meave has to wonder how Willem could have made it here in time to meet her, without inside information. The traitor was most likely in contact with the newly crowned king of Lyria. Our next stop is Angren, a monster-infested swamp now ran by Count Coldwell the traitor. The first order of business was a Nilfgaardian fort straight down the middle of our path. Reynard plans an attack immediately, but Gascon offers that he can open the gate for them using only 10 good men. He walks up to the fort, talks to the guard, and the gates do in fact open. Suspicious enough to have Reynard open his mouth. The spy working with Nilfgaard was none other than Gascon. The real reason he broke Meave out of prison was as a bargaining chip to treat with Nilfgaard, but by now, Gascon had come to respect and admire the queen and no longer wished to betray her. Unfortunately for Reynard, Gascon then fires back that Reynard isn't being entirely honest either. The reason Willem found them in Mahakam so quickly was because Reynard had kept up writing letters with the boy. Turns out they were both traitors. You can send both, one of them or neither away at this point, but that will also remove them from your army. Unrelated to the story otherwise, there's a side quest a little into the marsh too that is still bugged to this day. You beat some Nilfgaardians out of a lumberyard, and you can then requisition the wood for yourself, leave the lumber to the villagers, or pay them for the wood. You will never get the wood. If you pay them for it, you simply lose coin and then gain no wood. If you requisition the wood, no you don't. Not only that, if you give them 400 gold, the game removes another 250 gold from your pockets for no apparent reason. That's one hell of a swindle. When the army makes it to Tuzla Castle, where Caldwell's holed up, the Count doesn't resist, but he does talk a whole lot of shit because he knows Meave will kill him anyway. He also informs the Queen that more Nilfgaardian troops will soon arrive, and his death won't save her. Then he calls her dumb, so Meave throws him out of the window, which, quite honestly, is too quick a death for the guy, but I guess that's what he gets for his unsightly smarming. Caldwell had burned the only bridge out of the castle, but one of the locals knows of a way to escape the swamp anyway. Heavy stones dropped into the swamp to form a permanent hidden walkway. They march out of the castle and straight into Leechland. On the way, they run into a witcher, but not Geralt. Ivo of Belhaven is here to deal with the leech problem caused by a monster called Gurnicora. Ivo doesn't join up, but we do run into Gurnicora by the end, dispatching her quickly and burning the corpse. And before the swamp is truly over, we have another betrayal to go. This time it's Xavier who tries to strangle Meave to death in her tent before long. Turns out, he's always been a Nilfgaardian spy. and the non-humans didn't blow up the wall at Rossburg, he did. That's how he got so horribly burned. He would have succeeded too if Gascon and Reynard hadn't rushed in just then to save their queen. At last, we make it to the river where a barge awaits. If you've read the books, you know what happens next. Geralt and his Hanse had taken the barge, and Meve and her army are left scrambling with Nilfgaard on all sides. This part in the game definitely does not follow the books very directly, but it's a nice little end-of-the-line moment, where Meve charges the bridge held by Nilfgaardians, and Geralt and Cahir eventually show up to fight by her side. They win the battle, and Geralt is knighted of Rivia for real this time, for he deserts the army almost immediately. Meve and her army finally make it back to her realm, and the North, emboldened by her victories, take up arms against Nilfgaard proper. Willem suddenly requests a meeting with the Queen as well, to arrange a truce. He would be willing to renounce the Empire and pledge his forces, which were really Meve's forces, to his mother's army if she agreed not to rescind his reforms, guarantee his and his advisors' safety, and allow him to remain her direct heir, next in line to the throne. I generally tell him to get ploughed and march on Rivia Castle for the decisive battle, where I also tell Ebdahi to plough himself. That's a running theme in this part of the game. During the siege, you're to pick one of your advisors to enter the castle under cover of night in order to open the gate. If you did not tell Willem to stick it somewhere, whichever one you send out will die. Otherwise, Willem will unexpectedly sacrifice himself for the cause and open the gates for his mother's army, finally redeeming himself in the eyes of her and her soldiers, but leaving the Queen to grieve her fallen son, who, in the end slides, we could have learned, would have made a strong, capable, and just heir, had we taken him up on his offer. The Ebdahi battle was really the only one I had to carefully set up my deck for. He has an absolutely rancid passive ability that lets him replace any lost unit with another from his deck on top of a very consistent 10 power buff per turn to one of his allies. Ebdahi flees the scene covered in potato skins before we can get to him though. He flees to Aldersburg to be exact, while Nilfgaard is busy losing the war in general, and Amirva Emrys, blessed Emperor of Nilfgaard, sends a messenger out to order Ebdahi to off himself. Congratulations, we've won the war. Thronebreaker has everything going for it when it comes to people like me. I like The Witcher, card games, choices matter stories, it has it all. It doesn't always stick the landing. Certain events will happen, even if you realistically do everything you can to avoid them. It can make replays feel a little hollow in the end, but it really seems like CDPR made a great game and then decided not to care about it over much. Little details like the inability to access the options menu in the middle of a Gwent battle, certain pieces of information simply lacking during puzzles especially. If you're playing on Bonebreaker difficulty, the game will often lag on their turn because the AI is doing too many calculations. And they still make very silly mistakes constantly, like targeting a card that's already fulfilled its purpose over a card that still has an active order to use. Clicking too quickly during dialogue also bugs it out completely at times. Music cuts out when I reset a battle too quickly. And in general, the game has a million loading screens, partially because it keeps auto-saving when you do things the game deems as important, like leaving the deck building screen, even without making any changes. Something that could be solved by simply allowing us to have our own save files so we can decide when and where to save. There are typos and mispronunciations in parts of the game here and there too, and Rayla really is an especially strange case in terms of writing, even outside of her retcon. She'll enter Mahakam extolling your virtues, you're incredible and she respects you so much, only to turn around in a following quest and slaughter 40 chained dwarven prisoners in a cart because they could become Scoia'tael for real soon. And unlike the previous section, she didn't ask me for permission, she just does it. Then sarcastically bows when she's asked to leave. It's completely out of left field. I love and respect you so much, Meve. Thanks, Rayla. You're great. I mean, I would die for you at this point. You are my greatest hero.
A few moments later.
Rayla? Fuck you. And when I list these things out in this way, it might seem like an overwhelmingly buggy or incomplete game. It's not. Really, what I've just listed is everything I encountered that bothered me outside of things they patched already. Obsolete. Invisible card. Ignore.
What does it mean?
And while your actions might not generally have a particularly aggressive, tangible effect on the game's story, that doesn't mean the choices are boring or devoid of emotion. the most important part. Whether you choose to do A or B will eventually come back to haunt you or help you. In my case, it usually bit me in the ass, because I'm not very good at making objective decisions when it comes to certain aspects of the Witcher world.
My lady, this elf has most definitely sabotaged our food. He's innocent. Let's take him with us.
A few moments later.
My lady, the elf we took in earlier has suddenly and inevitably betrayed us. Curses.
And no, the stories aren't especially deep. They're mostly snippets of a war-torn land. They won't rend your heart like the mainline games do, but they do a fairly good job in building up your expectations of the rest of this story. The way the land and its people are dealing with the war, and the effects these meetings have on Meve. For me, following Meve's story was fun. I would have read this as a book too, because I like books and also good stories, but instead I got an interactive book with card games. How could I possibly be mad about that? But if a game doesn't immediately explode in popularity, CDPR seems to have a habit of just dropping it and moving on. The final question on the survey wasn't really a question. I asked if they had any thoughts on CDPR's general attitude towards releasing non-mainline games like Thronebreaker or Rogue Mage, another Gwent-related venture. Overwhelmingly, they wish there were more of them. More of these short but sweet experiences that focus very deeply on the story of a single character over the gargantuan beasts that are the mainline Witcher games. I've said this before, but when I bring up the Witcher games during my Twitch streams, more often than not, the people who don't get into the games cite the overwhelming amount of content as the reason. It's just too much. I don't know where to begin. A world can certainly be too open. Resources were also mentioned, or lack thereof. I won't pretend to know the budget Thronebreaker was working with, so I couldn't tell you its revenue for sure, but given their comments in the earnings report, I firmly believe it did make money. The best I have is the Steam revenue calculator, which puts their net revenue at over 4 million, however accurate that is. And that's obviously not including GOG or console sales and phone sales. Optimistically, I wouldn't say that's a waste of time and money, but line must go up. You know how it is in the game industry these days. Right now, all I know is that Thronebreaker's lack of success robbed me of a potential Iorveth installment, as well as a potential Zerrikania chapter surrounding the region's Witch Queen and Bork 3 Jackdaws, the storyteller Thronebreaker opens with. And I'm sure I wouldn't be telling them anything new in saying this, but the way Thronebreaker is built, I can't imagine it's impossible to reuse assets. They already have in using Gwent from their online version. Thronebreaker had some issues that need ironing out, but once you have your base, it's theoretically cheaper each time you create a new entry. Plenty of art assets don't need to be recreated each time, except if you make the Iorveth chapter. He will need at least 5 outfits, and one of them has to be shirtless in some fashion. This is very important for lore reasons. A lot of answers also followed the "what is Rogue Mage" line of questioning. Yeah, that's another Gwent-related property, but this one truly did terribly, and I can't even say it wasn't deserved. Rogue Mage was just not very good. It destroyed a lot of the canon lore surrounding its main character, and although the premise was fun and promising, it became stale very quickly due to the tiny amount of actual content available. I almost hit 100% achievements until I realized that one of them required an extremely rare, random situation that I wasn't willing to fish for. It almost felt like Rogue Mage had been in production during Thronebreaker, only for Thronebreaker to underperform, causing them to drop Rogue Mage mid-progress and call it a day. It launched with even less fanfare than Thronebreaker, and I know maybe a handful of people who have played that game. It does seem like the Gwent portion of Thronebreaker was a bit of a sticking point for several people. So, honestly, I'd say maybe give a pure visual novel a try. They are, on the whole, cheaper to make than most other games, so it should theoretically be easier to test what sticks. Bottom line is, Thronebreaker is a great game, with a good story, and, if you want it, a very fun card game. From the numbers we have, it certainly didn't lose money, and CDPR did mention that the concept isn't completely dead to the company. There's hope yet. Given their track record in terms of promotion, though, I'll just let you know if that ever gets announced. If you played Thronebreaker yourself, how did you feel about it, and would you play another installment? I'm also deathly curious to know what character you'd want to see in the lead role. My choice is obvious, but I'm a well-known frothing Iorveth enthusiast. If you haven't played Thronebreaker, why didn't you? Or maybe this is also the first time you've heard of the game at all. More common than I thought. Either way, thank you for watching all the way to the end. And an extra special thank you to my wonderful Ko-fi supporters, especially Robertson, MJ Coolsta, Adrian Packle, Laser, One's the Loneliest, I Save One, Danvers, Septic, and an honorary mention to Wall. And thank you as well to those of you who've decided to check out my streams on Twitch. I appreciate you all the absolute most, and I hope your pillow is a comfortable temperature at all times. Have a lovely day.